Hello everyone, here at the Nordic Project Zone, beautiful city of Copenhagen, and I'm joined by a gentleman called Dr. Harvey Maylor, who was actually the keynote speaker of the conference, and a very, very interesting presentation on why and how organization must have a strategic focus at a portfolio level. Harvey, thank you very much for joining us. So what's your view? Why is it important to have really a strategic focus at a portfolio level?
Okay, there's a number of things that we noticed that happened really well when organisations had this portfolio focus that we really would like to see happen in a much wider range of projects. So we started off with the notion that we see so often that projects are not considered a success. And yet when you go into organisations and start talking to people, they would say, actually, you know what, officially that might not be a success, but there's so many good things have happened from it. So there's this real challenge around what do we consider to be success. And the logic that we saw happening in the assessment was that there was this almost perfect requirement. Unless a project delivered everything it was asked of, absolutely on time and absolutely on budget, then it was considered to be a failure. Now, that in itself is not a great way of assessing success. And what we wanted to do was to develop the conversation to say, look, which one of those is the most important? As I said during the talk, that we have this idea, do you want it good or do you want it Tuesday? You can't have both. Choose one. Because when we then see that you have an organisation that's focused, that says, right, our priority is on delivery speed, we'll make sure we'll get it to you as quickly as can be achieved. You then see that you can align all the decisions and all the resourcing around that decision. And the impact of that is absolutely wonderful. And it's a case of it's very clear for people how they make decisions. It's very clear how we need to set the process up, the kind of people that we need, the kind of resources that we need to deliver that priority. Challenge is when you don't have that we see that organisations and individuals tend to fill in the gaps themselves. Unless there's a clear priority, we get happening that everybody will make up their own priorities. And when you have competing priorities in project world, so one department, so a purchasing department is saying, oh, we must buy at the cheapest cost, and you have a project manager who thinks, well, it's absolutely imperative for us to deliver quickly. Those objectives clash. And that's when we see that it becomes really, really difficult to get the delivery that anybody wants. So the key thing for us is to start getting this focus piece right, to decide on what it is, and then to work that through. And the key stages we saw in that this morning were that we first of all set up a strategic intent. We then develop that focus. We then arrange the fit to make sure that the priorities are aligned in the organisation and with our clients. And then we look at how do we configure. Right, so we take the priority. It's important for the organisations because when you get that alignment, you get this coherence happening, you get a resonance, and it really transforms delivery.
Okay, and here's a question for you. Many of the participants and project leaders, practitioners probably disagree with you and say, yeah, that's a great idea. How do I explain it to my board? How do I explain it to my CEO who wants everything yesterday and at the cheapest cost possible?
Okay, we see this so often, the chief executive that wants it perfect yesterday and for nothing. Yeah, so when we start discussing this, the first thing we do is just start off with trying to get acceptance of the notion that there are trade-offs in the world. You know, chief executive, when you go and buy a car, yeah, you wouldn't expect it to be cost no money, to have a fantastic performance, the performance of a Ferrari, but also the economics and safety of a much cheaper car. Which one do you want? You either want it really cheap, you want it really quick, or you want it really economical. Decide between those. You might be able to get two. You might be able to get a quick car that's also very cheap. But decide. You can't have all of them. So it's first of all to get them to actually make some decisions, which I know is hard with a lot of senior board members, but it's to have to make a decision about, come on, what is the focus? What do we really want this organisation to be about? And it's setting that strategic direction. I think it's a core piece of business leadership today. Unless they're setting that direction, as I say, bits of the organisation and individuals will make it up. They'll fill in the gaps.
Who decides on the strategic direction? Is it the CEO, the board, or the customers? Or is it kind of a combination of both?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is it should be the CEO and the board of the company. But what we said is, if you want competitive advantage, you're going to have to talk to the customers in a different way. To be talking not just about what do they want, but how do they want it delivered. And when we see projects, the project world's increasingly complex, though that conversation is a far more important one to be had today. So what is it that we're after? But also, how, do you want it delivered quickly? Do you want it delivered cheaply, or do you want is really the purpose of this project to actually see if our companies can work together in the future? Is it a relationship building piece? So those are the key things that for a board to think about.
So good project, good program, portfolio management actually can, and it is a true competitive advantage, and many project leaders probably agree with this notion. Now, what would you suggest, lastly, as a kind of the first step in order to convince our business leaders to look into this as possible competitive advantage? What do I have to do to get it right?
That is a real challenge. How do we take our thinking today, where for most business leaders it's projects? Well, just for goodness sake, don't mess up. The opportunity, get the projects right, and the competitive advantage could be phenomenal. One of the things I've used in the past is to talk about what happened in repetitive operations. So 20 or something years ago, most repetitive operations, so whether it was a manufacturing or a service operation, really struggled with that corporate buy-in. The factory or the delivery bit was the bit that a lot of members of the board wouldn't want to be too closely associated with. What changed was a number of studies that were published and a fundamental rethinking of what is the role of your operations capability in actually helping the business. And I have to say that a lot of the work that came out of the studies on the Japanese auto industry really helped us to make that case. Because what we saw there was operations were a strategic capability, and then we were able to go out to chief executives and say, look, these companies are having fantastic success because they treat operations capability as something that's very serious. It needs discussing at the highest level. What I really want to see happen is conversations that are starting, and they're happening in some boardrooms today, where those conversations happen about the project world. And say, come on, if our capability in projects could be turned around, what could it do for this company? And I think the opportunity is very similar to what it was with repetitive operations 20 years ago. And we saw the performance of those completely turn around. What's happening in repetitive ops in 20 years is incredible. What I'd love to see is that happen in project world, and the opportunity is there. I'm just waiting for a few more boards to take it a bit more seriously, but they can do, and they will do, I'm sure.
Harvey, you had a very interesting comment or notion on capacity, and you also mentioned that most of the organizations take on 3 times more projects than actually they have capacity, and you used an example for manufacturing. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit for our viewers?
Yeah. Key piece of how do we set up an organization to succeed and in delivering its focus is how does it manage its capacity. And you're absolutely right. What we've found is any organisation I've gone into that doesn't actively manage its project capacity assumes that pretty much infinite capacity scheduling is appropriate, that we can keep going, we can keep adding projects into the mix, and that's fine. The organisation will handle it. What we see happening so often is that they don't handle it, and just that extra work just creates additional noise in the organisation that just disrupts everything. And yes, the factor is that we've seen so often, if you go in and assess the capacity and assess the demand, usually the demand for projects is about 3 times as much as the capacity the organisation has to deliver. It's also one of those paradoxes, the more they try to deliver, quite often the less they'll get out. Key thing though about the capacity moving forward is we say, okay, can we start to manage this? Then yes, it's something that can be managed. It needs a lot of upfront work to say not only what delivery time is going to be needed for project work, but what management time is going to be needed. And we see some organisations pretty good at delivery time, less good at assessing the management time elements. So how much time do we need, how much time and energy do we need to put into particular projects? And it's one of those paradoxical things that quite often the more that organisations try to stretch the amount of capacity they have, the less they'll actually get out. So there's a couple of things. There's a first piece about let's see what capacity do we have. Firstly, let's then put that up against what our objectives are. So don't overstretch it, particularly if you're after a quality of delivery. And then say, okay, for the future, how do we grow that in some sort of sustainable way, but also remembering sometimes that just continually stretching that capacity and trying to get more out of the existing people you've got in particular will quite often be counterproductive. You'll actually get less out of them. So key thing for organisations is how do we use that capacity both now and in the future.
Is there effective tool available to estimate and measure and judge on the capacity of the organisation?
Yeah, I've seen all sorts of attempts at it. There isn't one that's jumped out and immediately grabbed me and said, "Hey, this is the way to do it," and this will give managerial information that's needed to make those kind of decisions. So right now, it's the kind of thing that quite often you'll see people being able starting to get to grips with this almost intuitively. So it's they know from experience how long things take. They've got to allow for disruptions. It inevitably happen with projects. It's a key piece of what we're up against. And being able to say, okay, can we respond flexibly? The tools, particularly in terms of the software tools I've seen, assume a far more certainty than is actually present in most projects. So we've got to be a little bit careful that tools as currently used quite often can be, again, work against us because they don't allow us that wiggle room that we need to deal with uncertainty. It's the difference between running a production plant where you usually have a high degree of certainty and running a project where almost anything can happen and probably will.